おはようございます。今日も朝のHoudini作業配信始めていきたいと思います。今日は昨日も言ってた通り、ちょっとドーナツなんぞを作ってみようかなと思います。
Welcome back to a
チュートリアルを
Houdini
やっていこうかなと思い
This
ま
is part
す。
2, and this one we're going over objects. So we touched on this in the last tutorial, but we didn't really get in depth. This tutorial we're going to go over how to create some objects, we're going to go over a couple more nodes, and we're just going to get comfortable with jumping between objects and bringing one object into another to reference it with object merges, all the while creating something interesting. We're creating a donut. So let's not waste any more time, let's get straight into it. To begin on creating this donut, of course we're going to need an object. So let's firstly create a
はい、ではHoudiniを立ち上げていきたいと思います。今回もバージョンは 18.5 でやっていきます。で、デスクトップも標準のものを使います。はい、ではやっていきましょう。
torus. So go up to your shelf tools and click on torus. Press enter to place it at the origin.
いつも通
And
り
we
ジ
now
オメ
have
トリ
this
オブジェ
torus.
クトを
It's
作
not the
っ
best
て、
donut so far, but we can make some changes to it. So first things first, let's give this a name. So double click on the name of this object and rename it to donut.
トースをなるほど。こっちからやる派か。
Go shelf tools and click on torus. Press enter to place it at the origin. And we now have this torus. Not the best donut so far, but we can make some changes to it. So first things first, let's give this a name. So double click on the name of this object and rename it to donut.
どうするんだっけ、コントロールしながらとかだっけ。センター配置か。
Then we can double click on the actual node to go inside of it and adjust this torus geometry. So we're going to give it some more rows. We can give this 50 rows and 50 columns, just so that it's smoother. Next, we're going to give it some color. So we've done this before. Just press tab, type color, and drop down a color node. Plug your torus geometry into this color node, and then don't forget to set your display flag on your color. So now we have our color selected. We can go and give this a healthy golden brown bagel color. Great. So now that we have that, let's give it a bit more of an interesting shape. It looks a bit too smooth right now. So we can press tab in our network view and drop down what is known as a mountain node. What a mountain node does is it adds a mountain noise to a geometry. So if we plug our color into our mountain node and then set our display flag on our mountain, you'll notice that we have this deformed donut. And all we have to do is really just drop the height. So just middle mouse on this height setting and bring it down to about 0.1. As you can see, that just adds a little bit of shape to our donut so that it looks a bit better. So now we have our donut. but we want to add some things. We want to add icing to it. Now, a good way to do this would actually be to make a separate icing object. That means we're going to go back up to the object level, create a new object called icing, and then we'll create our icing in there. But we may want to bring our donut into our icing object so that we can actually put our icing on our donut. So what we'll do is we'll drop a null. So in your network view, press tab, type null, and place it after your mountain. Connect your mountain to your null, and set your display flag on your null. Now you'll notice absolutely no difference between your mountain and your null, and that's because this null doesn't actually change anything. All it does is create a node that's very easy to reference. So we can just call this donut out, and now we know that this node over here is the output for our donut. So if we go up a level, we have our donut over here, and we can now create our icing. I'm just going to show you a different way to create an object where you don't need to use your shelf tools. You can just go over to your object network, press tab like we've done before, and over here you can type geo, and that will give you this geometry node. So we're going to place this, and you'll notice that it's the same node as this one over here, except there's nothing inside of it. So we're going to just rename it to icing, and then double click on the actual node to dive inside. As you can see, our donut gets ghosted as expected, but that means we can't work with it because we don't have it in our current context, which is icing. So to bring it into our icing node, we have to drop down an object merge. So press tab, type.
で、こんな、やけにはっきり見えるな。シェーディングかな。黒だとゴースト表示でもほぼはっきり見えんだな。白でやるか。
Object, and you'll see object merge. So now, to bring in our object, you can see over here that we want to bring in one object. So we go over to object 1, go over to this open floating operator chooser, and this will bring up this choose operator window. And we can just minimize our icing, and now you can get a really good idea of how our networks are set up. So as you can see, we have object network. Inside there, we have a donut and icing. So expand the donut and select this donut out. This is why it's useful. It's very easy to see which one is the output of this donut object when you named it like this and put it as a null. So we can just double click on this, and now it's in our icing node. So how are we going to make icing over here? The best way to do it is to drop down a group node and group some points that will be our icing. So press tab, type group, and press enter. That will give you a group node. So if you hover over this first input, it says required source data. We can plug our donut into this, set your display flag on the group, and then we go over to our parameters. So change the group name to icing underscore group. Now we have a group, it's just called icing group. It doesn't contain anything just yet. We're also going to change it from a group type of primitives to a group type of points. When you do that, you'll notice that these change to these little orange points as opposed to the faces. So we've changed it from being a primitive group, which would select faces, to a point group, which would select points on our geometry. So now over here under base group, you go over to the far right and you have this select geometry from an available viewport. So click on that and it will allow you to click and drag over some points. What we're going to do is we're going to hold space so that we can change our view, and then press 3 so that we have front viewport. Now we can select some points.
背景入りっぱなしやないか。
points. And the group node actually goes through to the other side. So if we select some point and press enter, and then hold space and press 1 to go back to perspective, you'll notice that it has selected points all the way around. So great. We now know that these orange points are the points in our group. So we have an icing group. The next thing to do is to go over to our network view and delete everything that's not in that icing group. So we can say delete, connect your icing group into the delete node, and then just set your display flag on your delete. And at the top of this delete node in your parameters, you'll notice that it has this group dropdown. If you click on it, you'll notice that there's this icing group. So we'll select that, and you'll notice that nothing's being deleted. And we also have this error message. To view what that error message is, we can hover over our delete node and click on this error message on the left. That's our node info, and it brings up this. It says, warning, icing group is not a valid group. And the reason it's not recognizing this group is because we set our group to be a points group. So under entity, you have to change it from primitives to points, and it will now delete all the points in our icing group. But we don't want that. We want to delete everything that's not in our icing group. So we change this operation to delete non-selected. Now we just have our icing group. But now what we can do is we can give this a bit of thickness. So what we want is to just extrude this surface up a bit. We can drop down a poly extrude node. So press tab, poly extrude, drop it down, plug your delete node into the first input, and set your display flag. Under your parameters, you have all of these options. The only one we really need to worry about is this distance. If we push this up, you'll notice that it gives us some distance, and what we want is just a little bit. So we'll do 0.01, 0.01. And as you can see, that's given us a bit of thickness. Our ghosted donut is actually getting in the way. So we can go up to the top right of our viewport, and where it says ghost other objects, click on that and say hide other objects. Now we only have our icing in this viewport. If you take a look, you'll notice that there's this lip and we don't have a back face. And that's because the poly extrude node doesn't actually output a back face. So we can go down over here on our parameters and just click on output back. So that creates a solid geometry. If you take a look at this, it gives us a front, it gives us a side, and a back. Output front, output side, output back. Perfect. So another cool option that you have on this poly extrude node is that you can actually output this front, back, and sides with a group. So we're going to tick this front group, and we're going to call this icing underscore top. And what that will do is it will add this front face to a group called icing underscore top. Just like we've done with our icing group, we now have a group called icing top. And we can actually see that it's been created. If we go to this poly extrude node, hover over it, and go to this node info. Click on that, and you'll see over here, we have two groups. We have a point group called icing group, and a primitive group called icing top. So now we can give our icing some color. So drop down a color node, and whatever you want this to be. Maybe we'll make this a chocolate donut. So we'll make this brown. Great. So that's looking good. The last thing to do, and remember it's just good practice, is to drop down a null, plug your color node into the null, and rename this null to icing underscore out. So if we go up a level to our object level, and then just click anywhere in our network view to deselect our icing, you'll notice that we now have a donut with some icing on it. So the reason that we output this top group is because we're not done yet. We want sprinkles. The donut isn't complete without sprinkles. So how are we going to add some sprinkles to this? So obviously sprinkles would be another object, right? So we need to drop down another geometry node. So in your network view, type geo, drop down a geometry node, and rename this one to sprinkles. Great. So we can now double click on our sprinkles node, and we're now inside of our sprinkles node. And if we want to ghost our objects again, we can go to the top right and say ghost other objects. We can now see our donut over there. And in our sprinkles node, we're going to bring in our icing. Like we've done before by bringing in our donut, we're now going to bring in our icing. So press tab, drop down an object merge node. we're going to go over to Object 1, go over to this Open Floating Operator chooser, and we're just going to go to our icing node, expand it, select icing out. Now our icing is in this node, we can use it to place our sprinkles. So we only want sprinkles to be placed on the top, right? So that means we only want the top group, and this is where that comes in handy. So drop down a delete node, tab, type in delete, connect your object merge to your delete node, and set your display flag on your delete. We're then going to go up to the group, click on the drop down, and as you can see, we have icing top. And it's currently deleting selected. We want it to delete everything that's not in that icing top group, so delete non-selected. And now, as you can see, we only have the top group. So what can we do with that? Well, there's a useful node for making points based on a geometry, and that's called scatter. So press tab and type in scatter, and drop down this scatter node. Plug your delete into the scatter, and as you can see, it makes a bunch of points. Right? They might not look like sprinkles right now, but at least we have some points. And if you can't see them very clearly, we can also just go over to our display settings on the right of our viewport, scroll down to this little circle, click on that, and that will make all of our points blue. And obviously that's just a visualization. It's not actually making our points blue, it's just showing up as blue so that we know where they are. So now that we can see our points a bit better, we can change the number of points that we have. So to change the number of points that you scattered, just change your force total count. So we don't want 1,000 points. We can just set this to 50. Now we have 50 points and they're quite evenly spaced. And to change how evenly spaced they are, you can go down to your relax iterations and decrease that. But now we want these points to be sprinkles. We don't want them to be points. So what we need to do is we need to first make a sprinkle. So, to the left of our scatter, we're going to drop down a tube. Place the tube, set your display flag on it so we can see it. And let's just change it. We'll change it from a primitive to a polygon. We'll give it end caps. So then we'll scale down its radius scale until it's about the shape of a sprinkle. And that doesn't look too bad. Now, clearly this is a very large sprinkle. If we were to replace all of our scattered points with these, they would be far too large. What we can do is we can actually give our points values that define how big each sprinkle will be when it replaces the point. Firstly, what we'll do is we'll use the node that allows us to replace all of our points with our tubes. To do that, press tab and type in copy to points. Place that down. And you'll notice that this is the first time we're seeing a node with two inputs. When you have two inputs, the first input's generally what gets output as well. So in this case, we're going to be outputting tubes. So that goes into the first input, and as you can see, it says required primitives to copy. So these are the primitives we're copying, and that's correct. Next, we take our scatter into the second input. That's the target points to copy to. That's also correct, so we plug it in there. And then set your display flag on your copy to points. All of a sudden, we have a bunch of these big tubes. But you might notice something interesting. All of these tubes are brown. The reason being is the icing that we brought in and then scattered points onto was brown. So I'm just going to show you something here. And this is probably the thing that people initially struggle with the most in Houdini, is the concept of attributes. So let's just go back to our scatter. Let's set our display flag on our scatter. And what we're going to do is we're going to go to the left over here and click on node info. As you can see over here, it says 2.attrs, right? Or attributes. These are 2-point attributes. We have CD and P. Now P is position. So think of it like this. These points have positions in space, and Houdini needs to know where those positions are so that it can put them in the correct positions, right? So each point has a position in space. And that is saved as an attribute called P. But we also have this attribute called CD, and this stands for color diffuse. This is our diffuse color. So now each point also has a color attribute. Why is this useful? Well, this is incredibly useful because everything in the physical world can be described by their attributes. a red car is red, and a car could also be moving or not moving. If it's moving, it has velocity. If it's not moving, it doesn't. And there's all sorts of different attributes that that car could have, and it would be different per car. And that's what makes it different from other cars. Just like in the physical world, when we're describing objects with attributes, we can do the same thing in Houdini. So we have color at the moment, but there's plenty of other attributes. So what we're going to do is we're going to add some attributes. Something to note is that some attributes are recognized by Houdini, such as CD and P, as we've seen. And other attributes are just user-made. They can be attributes that we're just using to calculate things. Perhaps we have an attribute on our donut called flavor, right? And depending on the flavor, it changes the color of the sprinkles and the color of the icing and all of that, right? So attributes can either be recognized by Houdini or they can be user-made. So we're going to create a few that are recognized by Houdini. And so what we're going to do is just click and drag over these three, move them up a bit, and between our scatter and copy to points, we're going to create something called an attribute create. So bring that in, place it after your scatter, and I know it looks very intimidating, there's a lot of things going on here, but if you remove it, you'll notice that, it's very simple, actually. All we're doing is we're adding an attribute. So it says number of attributes, click on plus, it adds an attribute. That attribute has a name. Now, if we set our display flag on attribute, and then we check our node info, you'll see it says attribute 1. Now what we can do is we can actually change this attribute name to something called p-scale. And this is an attribute recognized by Houdini. Houdini recognizes p-scale as a scaling attribute, a uniform scaling attribute. So it will also be a point attribute. That's important for p-scale. P-scale is a point attribute. It's a float, and this is all fine. The only other thing that will change is the actual value. So middle mouse on value, scroll down, and then we'll just push it up to 0.01, right? And now, if we set our display flag on our copy to points and switch off our point display, you'll notice that all of our sprinkles have been scaled down. And if we change the p-scale on our attribute create in this value, it changes the scale of our sprinkles. So the thing with copy to points is that it actually looks for certain attributes. It will look for color, it will look for p-scale. And when we copy these tubes to these points, it fetches them, applies it to the tubes, and you end up with these scaled down tubes everywhere. Now, as you go, you'll learn the names of different attributes that are recognized by Houdini, and that just takes a bit of time, and I'll do my best to tell you which ones are recognized by Houdini. For example, p-scale is recognized, CD is recognized, and also note that they are case sensitive. So if we take a look at the node information, you'll see that it's called CD, capital C, small d, capital P for P, and p-scale is all lowercase. And you'll learn all of these things as you go, so don't worry about it too much right now. So the other thing that we might want to do is randomize the color. So let's drop an attribute randomize. Just type attribute random. Or if you don't feel like typing that whole thing, you can say aran, plug that in after your attribute create. And by default, it actually randomizes your CD attribute, your color attribute. And as you can see, all of our sprinkles now have different colors. But something's a bit weird with our sprinkles, is they're all pointing straight up. Now, the reason that they're all pointing straight up is because it doesn't actually have an orientation attribute. Think of it like this. If you're taking these tubes and replacing all of the points with them, how would the tubes know how to orient themselves? Obviously, they need some sort of attribute, right? So in Houdini, there's a couple of attributes that you can use, but what we're going to use are normals. So press tab, type normal, click on normal, and plug it in before your scatter node. And this is the power of Houdini. If you want to add things in your chain of nodes, it's very easy to do so. So select your normal node, and where it says add normals to vertices, change this to points, because remember, we're working with points. And all of a sudden, your sprinkles are lying down. Now, to explain why that's happened, we can actually go over and set our display flag on our normal node, and go over to our viewport, to the right-hand side, and under our display points, we have display normals. And these are what normals look like, right? They're just pointing away from the surface. That's the easiest way to think about them. They're perpendicular to the surface, they're pointing away from the surface. So what Houdini does is when we scatter, these points actually keep those normals. And we had to put this normal before our scatter, because normals can only be calculated on geometry, not on points. So once we scatter, we keep the normals on our points, and then Houdini does something very interesting with the copy to points node. What it does is it aligns the z-axis of our tube with the normal direction that we're feeding it. So as you can see now, if we switch off our display normals, our sprinkles are all sitting on the surface, and they're looking great. And you can make more changes to this. So we can drop another attribute randomize if we want. And this time, we can randomize p-scale. So type in attribute name, p-scale, and instead of setting it, we'll multiply it. And that minimum value is too low, so we can just bring that up a little. Now, as we bring that up, you'll notice that the minimum size changes. So we now have some sprinkles, and you can change the tube radius, make them thinner. And then we can drop down a null, plug your copy to points into this null, rename this to sprinkles out. You can make changes to anything in this chain, and it's all procedural. So if you go over to your scatter, if we want more sprinkles, it's as easy as just increasing the number of sprinkles. So how crazy is that? We can end up with loads of sprinkles that all follow these rules that we've set, and they all have these randomized attributes. And you can add more attributes here. So don't worry too much about what I'm adding here, but you can do something with an attribute randomize, such as randomizing the up value. So type in up, lowercase, and it randomizes their rotations slightly. And so if we go down to our sprinkles out and take a look at this node info, you can see that as we've gone along, we've ended up with a lot of new attributes. We've got CD, we've now got P, we've got P-scale, we've got up, and these are all recognized by Houdini. And honestly, there's no easy way to learn these, but I do have a book on Patreon that goes over all of this. It goes to the scale, we end up with a lot of new attributes. Randomizing the up value. So type in up, lowercase. And it randomizes their rotations slightly. And so if we go down to our sprinkles out and take a look at this node info, you can see that as we've gone along, we've ended up with a lot of new attributes. We've got CD, we've now got P, we've got P-scale, we've got up, and...
なんだこれ。バージョンが変わって消えたのか。そういうことか。セットがこれで、アルファと N を除いてセットする、除いてセットするのか。で、こっちは、セットがなくなってコピーになって、で、この辺も除くようになったのか。というと最適化してたのか、いつの間にか。なるほどね。昔のバージョンってこうだったんだ。 ほど。
These are all recognized by Houdini, and honestly, there's no easy way to learn these, but I do have a book on Patreon that goes over all of this. It goes over the different types of attributes, how you use them, where you use them, why you would want to use them, and, you know, the lowercase, uppercase, the types that they are.
アップ見てみよう。これか。あとでキー、小さすぎて全然見えないな、もしかしてこれ。アップベクターって見れないの？わからん。で、バーンとか入ってんだ。あ、そっか、フラグ立ってるとこまでか。ボケすぎか。ここもう残ってないんだもん。これ、見てみるか。こういうことね。そうだよね。ここだよね。ちょっとなんか怖えな。黄色にしとこう。でけえ。うん。あ、そっか。ライダーマイズしないとそもそもアップがねえのか。これランダマイズ以外はできるな。あ、そっか。ランダマイズ以外セットできねえのか。まあいいや。
That's all pretty useful in a very easy to understand table. So if you want to check that out, consider supporting us on Patreon and you can get access to that. If you don't, you can just follow along with these tutorials and eventually you'll also figure all of these out. So now that we have our sprinkles, if we jump up a level, look at that. We have the very first thing we've made in Houdini, a donut. And it's a pretty good donut. You know, it's a very basic donut, but it's a donut. So you can be proud of yourself that you created this donut. And really, it would be useful for you to go through all of these nodes again and see what's happening and why it's happening, play around with them, remove some nodes, add some nodes. Just do whatever you want, you know, maybe replace these tubes with spheres. So you could do something like this. You could drop a sphere and make it a polygon mesh, plug it into this input over here. You know, there's so much that you can do. With Houdini, and this is just barely scratching the surface. So I'm doing my best to slowly administer Houdini to you in small, manageable chunks. So that's not too overwhelming. So I hope that this one wasn't too much. I know we touched on attributes, and attributes can be quite a lot to take in, but really, when you break it down, it's quite simple. So thank you for watching. If you like this tutorial, please consider liking and subscribing, leaving a comment, letting me know what I can do differently, what I can do better, always open to criticism, and your feedback is always helpful. If you'd like more advanced content, we do have other tutorials on our channel. We also have a Patreon that you can support us on, and in exchange, you'll get access to a bunch of different things. You can go check that out if you're interested. So thank you for watching. We'll be back with part 3 of Houdini Isn't Scary soon, so stay tuned for that, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
顔にしよう。重い。最高に気持ち悪いな。はい。一旦、今回はちょっとドーナツを作ってみました。今日の配信はここまでにします。また明日ご視聴ありがとうございました。